Millerville, Alabama, October 15, 1978. The morning bell at Millerville Elementary had already rung twice when Principal Robert Hayes noticed something unusual. Room 14's door remained closed, its small window dark. For the first time in 3 years, Sarah Catherine Mills wasn't standing at her classroom threshold, greeting her second-grade students with that warm smile that had made her beloved throughout the small cotton farming community. Sarah, 24, had moved to Millerville from Birmingham after completing her teaching degree at Auburn University. With her auburn hair always neatly pinned back and her collection of colorful cardigans, she had quickly become more than just a teacher. She tutored struggling students after hours, organized the annual Fall Festival, and had even started a small library in her tiny apartment above Henderson's General Store, lending books to families who couldn't afford them. That Thursday morning felt different from the moment the sun struggled through the October clouds. Mrs. Dorothy Henderson, who owned the store below Sarah's apartment, had knocked on the teacher's door at 6:30 a.m. when she noticed Sarah's light was still on from the night before. No answer. The 1975 yellow Volkswagen Beetle that Sarah drove everywhere was parked in its usual spot behind the building, keys still hanging from the ignition. Inside her apartment, everything appeared normal at first glance. Sarah's lesson plans for the week were neatly arranged on her small kitchen table, her coffee mug sat clean in the sink, and her bed was made with the same precision she brought to her classroom. But something felt frozen in time. The previous day's mail lay unopened on the counter, and her purse sat on the dresser, undisturbed. Sheriff Tommy Caldwell, a man who had known every resident of Millerville for the past 15 years, stood in Sarah's doorway that afternoon, his weathered hands turning his hat in slow circles. He had investigated missing livestock, domestic disputes, and the occasional break-in at the farming equipment store. But this was different. Young women didn't simply vanish from their locked apartments in towns where everyone knew everyone else's business. The last confirmed sighting of Sarah had been at Pate's Diner on Wednesday evening around 8 p.m. Waitress Linda Sue Morrison remembered serving her the usual meatloaf, mashed potatoes, and sweet tea. Sarah had seemed quiet, perhaps a little distracted, but nothing that raised alarm bells in a small town where people often kept their concerns to themselves. As word spread through Millerville's 800 residents, an uncomfortable silence settled over the community. Sarah Mills had simply disappeared, leaving behind 23 worried students, a classroom full of half-graded papers, and a mystery that would haunt the town for nearly half a century. The search for Sarah Mills began at dawn on Friday, October 16, 1978. Volunteer groups formed spontaneously in the parking lot of First Baptist Church, men carrying hunting rifles and women packing sandwiches in brown paper bags. The autumn air was crisp, filled with the scent of burning leaves and the undercurrent of fear that had settled over Millerville overnight. Sheriff Caldwell organized search parties that spread across the surrounding farmland and pine forests. They combed through cotton fields where stalks stood shoulder-high, checked abandoned barns, and walked the banks of Mulberry Creek that wound through the county. State police brought in tracking dogs, but the scent trails led nowhere conclusive, stopping abruptly at the edge of Highway 67, as if Sarah had simply vanished into the asphalt. Sarah's older sister, Margaret, drove down from Huntsville with her husband and 2 young children. She moved into Sarah's apartment temporarily, hoping her presence might somehow bring answers. Margaret found her sister's diary, but the entries revealed only the mundane concerns of a dedicated teacher. Worry about little Tommy Peterson's reading level, excitement about the upcoming Halloween party, plans to visit their parents in Birmingham for Thanksgiving. The FBI arrived after the first week, setting up a command center in the Millerville Community Center. Agent Patricia Lawson, one of the few female agents in Alabama at the time, interviewed dozens of residents. She discovered that Sarah had been quietly dating James Fletcher, a 28-year-old mechanic who worked at Butler's Auto Repair. James voluntarily took a polygraph test and passed, but rumors still spread through town like kudzu in summer. As weeks turned into months, the search efforts began to fragment. Some residents believed Sarah had been the victim of a crime, possibly connected to a series of unsolved disappearances of young women across the southeast. Others whispered that she might have simply walked away from her life, overwhelmed by pressures no one had recognized. A few insisted they had seen her in Montgomery or Mobile, but every lead led to dead ends and false hopes. The emotional toll on Millerville was profound. Parents began driving their children to school instead of letting them walk. Women avoided going out alone after dark. The innocence that had defined the small farming community seemed to evaporate, replaced by locked doors and suspicious glances at strangers. By Christmas of 1978, the active search had wound down. Sarah's parents, Robert and Helen Mills, visited Millerville monthly, posting new flyers with their daughter's photograph and pleading for any information. But as the seasons changed and new crises demanded attention, Sarah's disappearance became part of the town's painful history, a wound that never quite healed, mentioned in hushed tones when discussing the way things used to be. The case file grew thick with dead-end investigations, false leads, and theories that led nowhere. Sheriff Caldwell kept Sarah's missing person report on his desk for 12 years until his retirement, when it passed to his successor, then to the next sheriff, and the next. Each new law enforcement official would review the case, shake their head at the lack of concrete evidence, and file it away with dozens of other cold cases that haunted Alabama's rural counties. Millerville, Alabama, March 2023. The demolition of Henderson's General Store had been postponed 3 times over 2 decades, but rising property taxes and the owner's death finally forced the family's hand. Jake Morrison, Linda Sue's nephew, who now ran a small construction company, had won the bid to tear down the building that had anchored Millerville's main street since 1952. Jake's crew started with the 2nd floor, the apartment where Sarah Mills had lived 45 years earlier. Most longtime residents avoided walking past the construction site, but some found themselves drawn to watch the systematic dismantling of a place that held so many memories. The October morning when Jake's sledgehammer broke through the wall between the bedroom and bathroom, nobody expected to find anything more than old insulation and mouse droppings. The cavity revealed a blue Samsonite suitcase, wedged tight between the wall studs. Its surface was covered in dust and cobwebs, but the latches still functioned. Jake set it carefully on the apartment floor, his hands surprisingly gentle for a man accustomed to demolition work. Inside, wrapped in a faded yellow blouse that several older residents immediately recognized as something Sarah used to wear, were items that made Jake step back and reach for his cell phone. A stack of letters tied with a pink ribbon, Sarah's Auburn University class ring, a small address book with carefully written entries, and at the bottom, a manila envelope containing photographs and documents that would finally provide answers to questions that had haunted Millerville for nearly half a century. Sheriff Maria Santos, who had only heard stories about the Mills case from her predecessor, arrived within an hour. She was the first Hispanic sheriff in the county's history, elected 2 years earlier on a platform of modernizing law enforcement and solving cold cases using new technology. As she carefully examined the suitcase contents, she realized she was looking at evidence that had been hidden for decades. The letters were in Sarah's handwriting, but they were never sent. They were addressed to her sister Margaret, to her parents, and to James Fletcher. Each letter contained the same devastating revelation. Sarah had discovered something about someone in Millerville, something that had put her in terrible danger. She wrote about planning to leave town secretly, about being afraid to trust anyone, about evidence she had hidden, where only the walls could keep it safe. But it was the manila envelope that provided the most shocking evidence. Inside were photographs, not of Sarah, but of financial documents, bank statements, and handwritten ledgers. The documents showed systematic theft from the Millerville School District's budget, involving amounts that would have been significant in 1978. Money meant for textbooks, school supplies, and building maintenance had been diverted over several years, with a trail of evidence pointing to someone in a position of trust and authority. Sheriff Santos spread the photographs across a table in the department's conference room, studying them under bright lights. The handwriting on the ledgers was cramped and careful, noting discrepancies between official school board reports and actual expenditures. Sarah Mills, the dedicated teacher who stayed late tutoring students, had apparently stumbled across evidence of embezzlement that threatened to destroy someone's carefully constructed lie. As Santos continued examining the evidence, she found Sarah's final unsent letter, the one that would explain everything. It was dated October 14, 1978, just 1 day before Sarah disappeared. In it, Sarah wrote that she had arranged to meet someone the following evening to discuss what she had discovered. She mentioned being afraid, but feeling obligated to confront the situation for the sake of the children whose education was being stolen. The letter ended with a sentence that sent chills through everyone who read it. "If something happens to me, remember that the truth is hidden where I can see my students every day." Sheriff Santos knew that the suitcase discovery was only the beginning. The evidence Sarah had so carefully documented pointed to financial crimes, but it didn't explain how a respected educator had become capable of murder. To build a complete case, Santos needed to understand the man Robert Hayes had been in 1978 and what had driven him to such desperate measures. The investigation took Santos deep into Millerville's past, interviewing residents who had known Hayes during his tenure as principal from 1975 to 1983. What emerged was a portrait of a man under tremendous pressure, both personal and professional. Hayes had been hired to modernize the rural school district, but he had inherited a system plagued by outdated facilities, inadequate funding, and resistance to change from the school board. Former school board member Charles Whitman, now 84, and one of the few survivors from that era, provided crucial insight during a lengthy interview at his farm outside town. "Bob Hayes came to us from Montgomery with big ideas," Whitman recalled, adjusting his hearing aid as he spoke. He wanted new textbooks, better playground equipment, updated heating systems, but the board was tight with money. Cotton prices were down, property taxes were stagnant, and folks were already complaining about spending. Santos discovered that Hayes had initially tried legitimate means to improve the school. He had written grant applications, organized fundraisers, and lobbied the state education department for additional resources. But when those efforts failed to produce significant results, he had apparently decided to take matters into his own hands. The embezzlement had started small in early 1977. Hayes would authorize payment for supplies that cost slightly less than invoiced, pocketing the difference. He created fake vendors for cleaning services and maintenance work, processing payments to post office boxes he had established in nearby towns. For over 18 months, he had stolen nearly $15,000, equivalent to almost $70,000 in today's money. But Santos also uncovered evidence that Hayes hadn't been motivated purely by greed. Bank records showed that much of the stolen money had been spent on school supplies, items Hayes purchased personally and donated anonymously to teachers. Sarah's own classroom had benefited from these mysterious donations of art supplies, books, and educational materials that she had mentioned appreciatively in letters to her parents. The psychological profile that emerged was of a man who had convinced himself that his crimes were justified. Hayes believed he was stealing from an indifferent bureaucracy to help children who deserved better. In his mind, he was Robin Hood, not a common thief. Dr. Patricia Reeves, a forensic psychologist Santos consulted, explained the mindset. People who commit these types of crimes often develop elaborate rationalizations. Hayes probably saw himself as a victim of an unfair system and his thefts as a form of justice. When Sarah threatened to expose him, she wasn't just threatening his career, she was threatening his entire self-image as someone who helped children. Santos also investigated Hayes's personal life in 1978. He had been married to Ruth Hayes, a quiet woman who taught Sunday school at First Methodist Church. They had 2 young daughters, ages 6 and 8, who attended the elementary school where their father served as principal. The family lived in a modest house on Elm Street, 3 blocks from the school and were considered pillars of the community. But financial records revealed stress in the Hayes household. Robert's salary as principal was $12,000 per year, adequate for basic needs, but insufficient for the lifestyle the family maintained. Ruth had been undergoing expensive medical treatment for chronic health issues, and the family had taken out a second mortgage on their home in early 1978. The pressure had been building for months before Sarah's disappearance. Hayes was juggling stolen funds, legitimate expenses, and the growing complexity of covering his tracks. Several teachers later recalled that he had seemed increasingly stressed during the fall of 1978, often staying late at school and appearing distracted during meetings. Santos found a crucial piece of evidence in the county clerk's office. Hayes had inquired about transferring to a principal position in Florida just 2 weeks before Sarah disappeared. The inquiry suggested he was already planning an escape route, possibly anticipating that his embezzlement would eventually be discovered. The timeline Santos reconstructed showed a man spiraling toward a breaking point. Hayes had managed to maintain his scheme for over a year, but Sarah's accidental discovery had created a crisis he couldn't resolve through his usual manipulations. When she insisted on involving the school board, Hayes faced exposure, criminal charges, and the destruction of everything he had built. Dr. Reeves's analysis suggested that Hayes had likely convinced himself that silencing Sarah was another justified action, protecting not just himself but his family, and even the school district from scandal. In his distorted thinking, Sarah became the threat to the children he believed he was helping, she explained. Removing that threat would have seemed logical, even necessary. As Santos pieced together Hayes's psychological state in October 1978, she began to understand how a dedicated educator had become capable of murder. The evidence pointed to a man who had lost touch with reality, consumed by rationalizations that allowed him to see criminal acts as noble gestures. Sarah Mills had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time, armed with information that threatened to bring down Hayes's carefully constructed house of cards. The name that appeared repeatedly in Sarah's hidden evidence was one that shocked everyone who had known Millerville in 1978. Robert Hayes, the respected principal who had first noticed Sarah's empty classroom that October morning 45 years earlier. Sheriff Santos spent weeks following the paper trail Sarah had documented. Bank records from 1978, preserved in state archives, confirmed the discrepancies Sarah had identified. Hayes had been systematically skimming money from the school district's budget, using his position to authorize fake invoices and redirect funds to a personal account he had established in Montgomery. But Robert Hayes had died in 1994, taking his secrets to the grave in Millerville Cemetery. Santos faced the challenge of solving a murder where both victim and perpetrator were long dead, with only Sarah's hidden evidence to tell the story of what had happened in October 1978. The breakthrough came when Santos interviewed Helen Morrison, Linda Sue's elderly mother, who was now 89 and living in a nursing home in Huntsville. Helen had worked as a part-time secretary at the school in the late 1970s, helping with filing and administrative tasks. When Santos showed her Sarah's evidence, Helen's eyes filled with tears. "I remember Sarah asking me about those invoices," Helen whispered, her voice barely audible. "She said the numbers didn't make sense. I told her to talk to Mr. Hayes about it. I thought I was being helpful." Helen paused, struggling with a memory she had buried for decades. "A few days after Sarah disappeared, Mr. Hayes asked me to destroy some old financial records. Said we needed to make room in the filing cabinets. I didn't think anything of it at the time." Further investigation revealed that Hayes had likely confronted Sarah after she scheduled a meeting with the school board for October 16, 1978, the day after she vanished. Phone records, though incomplete, showed calls between Hayes's home and the school that evening of October 14th. Santos theorized that Hayes had convinced Sarah to meet him privately first, probably suggesting they could resolve the matter quietly to avoid scandal in the small community. The final piece of evidence came from an unexpected source. James Fletcher, Sarah's boyfriend, who was now 73 and living in Mobile. When Santos contacted him about the new evidence, James broke down crying. He revealed a secret he had carried for 45 years. "Sarah called me that night," James said over the phone. "October 14th, around 10 p.m. She sounded scared, said she was meeting Mr. Hayes the next morning before school to discuss something important. She asked me to come by her apartment that evening, but I had to work late at the shop. I told her we'd talk the next day." His voice cracked. "I should have gone to her. I should have known something was wrong." James remembered that Sarah had mentioned finding something in Hayes's office when she had volunteered to help organize old files. She told James she had discovered financial documents that didn't make sense, but she wanted to give Hayes a chance to explain before involving the school board. Based on the evidence, Santos concluded that Hayes had likely killed Sarah during their meeting on October 15th, either accidentally during a confrontation or deliberately to prevent exposure. He had then hidden her body somewhere it would never be found, while maintaining the facade of a concerned principal, helping with the search efforts. The suitcase had been hidden in the wall cavity during renovations Hayes had authorized in Sarah's apartment in early November 1978, ostensibly to repair water damage from a supposed leak. Hayes had likely discovered Sarah's evidence collection and realized she had hidden more documentation. By sealing it within the wall, he had ensured the evidence would remain hidden indefinitely. On October 15, 2023, exactly 45 years after Sarah Mills disappeared, Sheriff Santos held a press conference announcing the resolution of the case. While Sarah's body was never recovered, the evidence clearly pointed to Robert Hayes as her killer. The case was officially closed, bringing some measure of peace to Sarah's surviving family members and the Millerville community. Margaret Mills, now 71, attended the press conference with tears in her eyes. "Sarah was always the one who stood up for what was right," she told reporters. Even at the end, she was trying to protect those children's education. She died because she couldn't turn away from injustice. The Millerville School District established the Sarah Catherine Mills Memorial Scholarship in her honor, funded by restitution recovered from Hayes's estate. Her empty classroom had been converted to a library years earlier, and a small plaque now commemorates the teacher who gave her life defending the education of the children she loved. The truth had indeed been hidden where Sarah could see her students every day, within the walls of the building where she had lived and died, watching over the community that never forgot her, waiting 45 years for justice to finally break through.